Imagine going to your doctor, with debilitating physical symptoms, only to discover that 81% of the diagnostic tools they are using to measure your condition are just entirely scientifically invalid.
Right. I mean, you simply wouldn't accept that for a heart condition or, a broken bone.
Exactly. But in the world of pelvic floor health, specifically when we are looking at vaginal laxity, that is the exact diagnostic nightmare that patients, researchers, and doctors are currently trapped in.
It really is a profound failure of measurement. We're looking at this scenario where subjective female pain and discomfort are entirely real. But, and this is the kicker, the clinical trials designed to evaluate treatments for that pain, well, they are relying on a completely fractured, unreliable foundation of data.
Yeah, which is exactly why we're here today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring the massive gap between a patient's lived experience of pelvic floor symptoms and, quite frankly, the medical world's sheer inability to accurately measure them.
It's a huge disconnect.
It really is. And for you listening, we're pulling from a pretty deep stack of sources today. We've got clinical systematic reviews, NHS and NICE guidelines, position statements from the British Society of Sexual Medicine, and some really highly critical analyses of the psychometrics behind patient-reported outcome measures.
Which, honestly, is where the core of this crisis really lives. Because when physical anatomy doesn't neatly align with the symptoms a patient reports, medicine just has to rely on those patient-reported questionnaires.
Right.
And as our sources reveal in pretty stark detail, those questionnaires are heavily, heavily compromised.
Okay, let them tack this. Because this diagnostic gap, it isn't just some abstract, philosophical problem for academics. It is an active crisis in clinical trials right now.
Absolutely.
And if we look at the recent guidelines, the root of this crisis actually starts with a basic foundational definition. It seems like the medical field hasn't even established a universal clinical definition for what vaginal laxity actually is.
Yeah, that is the first major roadblock. I mean, vaginal relaxation syndrome, or VRS, it isn't defined by a single anatomical benchmark. It's primarily what we call a symptom-led term.
Meaning the patient has to tell you they have it.
Exactly. It describes a patient-reported feeling, like a feeling of looseness, a loss of internal physical resistance, or a feeling of reduced pelvic support.
I mean, I'm just trying to think of how you standardize that. Trying to medically validate laxity is kind of like trying to objectively measure, coziness?
Coziness, yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Right, everyone knows what it feels like. You immediately recognize it when you're experiencing it. But, well, you can't exactly take a blood test for coziness and just graph it on a chart.
That captures the subjectivity perfectly.
Yeah.
And it is compounded by the fact that laxity heavily overlaps with other established clinical conditions.
Oh, right, because the symptoms are isolated.
Right. A patient might come into the clinic reporting a change in sensation or, say, a feeling of pelvic heaviness. But under the hood, anatomically speaking, that sensation could be driven by postnatal changes to the levator ani muscles.
So muscle changes from childbirth.
Exactly. Or it could be tied to GSM, which is the genitourinary syndrome of menopause, where the degradation of collagen and elastin from, dropping estrogen levels changes the tissue's physical elasticity.
Ah, so it mimics the mechanical feeling of laxity.
Exactly. It mimics it completely.
Or I guess it could even be early-stage pelvic organ prolapse.
Precisely. And because the root causes are just so wildly varied, clinical assessments have historically tried to anchor this subjective feeling to objective physical measurements.
The old, if you can't measure the feeling, measure the hardware approach.
Yes, measure the hardware. But, as we see in the literature, testing the hardware is failing just as spectacularly.
Okay, let's look at that. The standard clinical tool for mapping pelvic support is the POPQ exam, the pelvic organ prolapse quantification exam. And writing about this, it is incredibly meticulous.
It is very thorough.
Clinicians are measuring specific points of vaginal descent relative to the hymen during a Valsalva maneuver. They are quite literally using a ruler, tracking millimeters of tissue movement. It looks like hard, objective science.
And the POPQ is an excellent tool for mapping static anatomy. There's no doubt about that. And alongside it, clinicians often use manometry or digital testing to measure the exact squeeze strength.
Right, like the endurance of the pelvic floor muscles in millimeters of mercury.
Exactly. So you map the structure, you measure the strength. The assumption for decades has just been that a weaker muscle or a lower anatomical position would directly mathematically correlate with a patient's feeling of laxity.
But the data tells a completely different story.
A radically different story. When you look at prospective case-controlled studies comparing urogenital symptoms to those POPQ findings, they reveal a massive disconnect.
How massive.
Well, women report a wide array of incredibly bothersome symptoms: pelvic heaviness, dragging sensations, lower backache. Yet many of those exact same women present with absolutely zero anatomical prolapse on the POPQ.
Wow. And on the flip side, you have women with objectively measurable, significant anatomical descent who report feeling absolutely fine. Their symptom bother is practically zero.
It's entirely paradoxical.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the pelvic floor muscle testing. There's this really critical study by Ali, Higgs, and Smith in our sources that looks specifically at those objective manometry and digital squeeze scores.
And they compared them against the POPSS, right, the pelvic organ prolapse symptom score.
Right. And what they found is just, well, it completely upends conventional wisdom.
This was the major aha moment for me in these sources, because not only was there no significant positive association between muscle strength and symptom relief, but the correlation values were actually inverse in some cohorts.
Yes, inverse.
That just blew my mind. Like, how is it physically possible that a stronger muscle squeeze on a clinical machine correlates with a worse feeling of laxity for the patient?
It seems completely counterintuitive until you actually look at the biomechanics of the pelvic floor. So the pelvic organs are held up by two systems.
Okay.
You have the passive support, which is the fascia and connective ligaments, and you have the active support, which is the levator antemuscle group. One leading hypothesis for this inverse correlation is a compensatory mechanism.
Meaning the muscles are basically working overtime to make up for a failure somewhere else.
Exactly. If a patient has sustained micro-trauma to the fascia, so the connective tissue is stretched or damaged, that passive support is just gone.
Ouch. So she feels a profound sense of laxity and heaviness.
Right, and to compensate for that, her pelvic floor muscles might be constantly engaged,
Yeah.
almost in a state of chronic spasm or hypertonicity, just desperately trying to hold everything in place.
Ah, I see. So when the clinician inserts the manometry device to test her squeeze strength, the machine registers an incredibly strong high-tone muscle.
The machine basically gives her an A+ for muscle strength, but her lived reality is that her connective tissue is failing, and she is experiencing severe daily dysfunction.
So the physical measurement completely invalidates her actual biological experience.
Entirely, which puts researchers in a terrible position.
I mean, yeah, if the clinical rulers and the pressure machines are generating data that doesn't actually reflect the patient's condition, how on earth do you run a clinical trial to prove a new treatment even works?
Well, you have to bypass the physical machines and go straight to the patient. You rely on patient-reported outcome measures, PROMs.
The standardized questionnaire.
Yes, the questionnaires. In modern clinical trials for vaginal laxity, these forms are the ultimate arbiter of truth.
Right.
To prove that a new surgical technique or a localized physical therapy regimen or, a laser device actually cures laxity, researchers administer these forms before and after the intervention.
And the statistical shift in the questionnaire score is the proof of efficacy. Like, my score went from a 10 to a 2, so the treatment worked.
Exactly. That is the gold standard for evidence right now.
I'm really struggling to square this, though. Because if I'm looking at the data from Hung Kun Chen's recent systematic review, which was published in Health and Quality of Life Outcomes, the sheer heterogeneity of these questionnaires is terrifying.
Oh, it is a statistical nightmare.
The review looked at 69 different clinical studies evaluating treatments for vaginal relaxation syndrome. And across those 69 studies, researchers utilized 57 different questionnaires.
57. It completely shatters the ability to synthesize data.
Right. I mean, if scientists are using 57 different grading rubrics across 69 studies, isn't that like grading a final exam where the teacher hasn't even decided what the right answers are?
It really is.
Like, how can cross-study comparison even mathematically exist? It's like trying to calculate a universal GPA, where some teachers are grading in letters, some are grading in percentages, and a few are just grading in emojis.
That is exactly the problem. The short answer is cross-study comparison isn't possible. Meta-analyses, which are the absolute highest level of clinical evidence we have, they require homogeneous data.
You need to be able to compare apples to apples.
Precisely. You cannot pool the results of treatment A and treatment B if they were measured using entirely different subjective scales.
Right.
And the statistics from that review, they get even darker when you really dig in. Of those 57 different questionnaires, over 73% were used only a single time in the literature.
Meaning a research team basically just wrote their own survey for their specific trial, used it once, and then threw it away.
Yes. And most critically, a staggering 81.09% of these measurement tools are completely unvalidated.
Okay, let's really drill down into that word, unvalidated.
Yeah.
Because I think for a lot of people listening, a medical questionnaire just looks like a form on a clipboard.
Sure.
What does psychometric validation actually require in this context? What makes a piece of paper valid?
It requires adhering to rigorous psychometric frameworks, like the Kazmin checklist. That stands for the consensus-based standards for the selection of health measurement instruments.
Okay, Cosmo.
For a clinical questionnaire to be considered scientifically valid, it has to pass several brutal stress tests. The first is content validity. Does the tool comprehensively measure the construct it actually claims to measure? And is it comprehensible to the patient?
And this is where a lot of them fail, right? Because they conflate sexual function with physical laxity.
Yes, constantly.
If a questionnaire only asks a patient about their arousal or lubrication during intimacy, but the patient's primary distress is a feeling of structural heaviness when she's, say, lifting weights at the gym, the questionnaire is just blind to her reality.
It completely misses it.
It lacks content validity for her specific condition.
That is a primary flaw. Many studies actually co-opt questionnaires like the FSFI, the Female Sexual Function Index. Now, it is a beautifully validated tool, but for sexual dysfunction.
Not for laxity.
Right. It was not designed to measure the structural sensation of vaginal laxity. So when researchers force a square peg into a round hole, the data just degrades.
What about the bespoke questionnaires? The ones researchers just make up on the fly for their own single studies.
Oh, those usually fail on construct validity and internal consistency. Meaning, do the items within the scale logically correlate with each other, and do they align with other established clinical benchmarks?
I see.
And they also wildly fail on test-retest reliability.
Meaning, if a patient's underlying physiological condition hasn't changed at all, will she answer the survey the same exact way on a Tuesday as she does on a Thursday?
Exactly. And with laxity, symptoms fluctuate wildly based on a woman's menstrual cycle, her hydration levels, or even her physical load that day.
Oh, so if she did a lot of heavy lifting on Wednesday, Thursday's survey is going to look terrible.
Right. If an unvalidated questionnaire is hypersensitive to those daily fluctuations rather than long-term structural changes, a trial might conclude that a treatment worked simply because the post-treatment survey was taken on a low-symptom day.
Wow, that is terrifying. Which brings us to the VLQ, the Vaginal Laxity Questionnaire. According to the data, this is the second most popular tool in the entire field.
Yep. Using nearly a quarter of all the laxity studies reviewed.
And yet, the American Urogynecologic Society pointed out in their clinical consensus statement that the VLQ was created for one specific historical study and has never been formally validated.
Never.
A quarter of the medical literature on vaginal laxity is resting its claims of success on a questionnaire that hasn't passed basic scientific quality control.
And this is where the academic debate over psychometrics turns into a very real, very dangerous public health issue, because bad measurement leads to the aggressive marketing of expensive, unregulated, and potentially risky treatments.
Because there's a vacuum of data.
Exactly. The inability of the scientific community to agree on a validated yardstick has created a huge vacuum. And into that vacuum, commercial enterprise has just rushed right in.
We are talking about energy-based devices, EBDs, the massive explosion of fractional CO2 lasers and radiofrequency devices being marketed directly to consumers is the ultimate cure for vaginal laxity, GSM, and incontinence.
The marketing for these devices is just relentless. They are positioned as quick, non-surgical rejuvenation procedures. And the brochures and clinics, they point to published studies showing massive improvements in patient scores.
But when you actually look at those studies, you see they are relying on the exact unvalidated proms we've been discussing.
The exact same ones, which explains why the regulatory bodies are stepping in so aggressively right now.
Right. The FDA in the United States, the TGA in Australia, ACs in the UK, they have all issued severe warnings regarding EBDs for vaginal laxity.
The American Urogynecologic Society, OGS, even convened a panel of experts using a Delphi method to address this specifically.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, a Delphi method is essentially a highly structured, multi-round debate where experts anonymously review the literature and vote until they reach a formal consensus.
Right. It removes the loudest voice in the room bias.
That's super rigorous.
And the consensus that emerged from that rigorous process was stark. There is a severe lack of high-quality, long-term, placebo-controlled trials for these laser and radio frequency devices.
The placebo-controlled aspect is really fascinating to me in the context of a laser because how do you even run a sham trial for a medical device?
It is incredibly difficult, but it's absolutely vital. Professor Jason Abbott has been highly vocal about this in the literature.
How does it work?
Well, in a sham-controlled trial for an EBD, the control group still goes into the clinic. They lie on the table, the clinician inserts the probe, the machine makes all the high-tech beeping noises, but, and here's the key, no actual laser or radiofrequency energy is fired.
Oh, wow. And what happens to the control group's survey scores?
They often go up
You're
significantly.
kidding, just from the beeps?
The placebo effect in intimate health interventions is notoriously powerful. The clinical encounter itself, the attention from a specialist, the feeling of doing something proactive, the high-tech environment, that alone can cause a patient to report improvement on a subjective, unvalidated questionnaire.
So if a patient pays, say, $2,000 out of pocket for a laser treatment and then fills out a flimsy 1 to 5 scale asking if she feels better, well, she is highly incentivized, both financially and psychologically, to report a positive outcome.
She absolutely is. And that reported outcome gets published as clinical evidence of efficacy.
Wow.
This is exactly why Professor Abbott noted that menopausal and laxity symptoms are deeply susceptible to subjective bias. He stresses that the paradigm must be medicine before marketing.
Medicine before marketing. I love that. That really feels like the central thesis of this entire deep dive. Right now, subjective female pain is being aggressively monetized because science hasn't yet figured out how to mathematically quantify that pain.
Yes, the marketing is winning because the medicine hasn't established the yardstick.
That is such a harsh clinical reality. And it's why the standard of care in the major medical guidelines hasn't shifted toward these novel technologies.
Not at all. If you look at the NICE guidelines, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, they draw a very firm line. Because of the validation limits of these device trials, conservative care must be prioritized first.
Meaning you don't jump straight to a laser, you start with pelvic floor rehabilitation. And we aren't just talking about telling a patient to go home and do Kegels while they wait in traffic.
No, absolutely not.
Sure.
The guidelines advocate for supervised physiotherapy, assessing muscle coordination, releasing hypertonic muscles, and building endurance.
And for patients whose laxity sensation is actually driven by the tissue changes of GSM, the gold standard remains medically proven localized vaginal estrogen therapy to restore the collagen and elasticity of the tissue.
It requires actual clinical detective work.
Right, rather than a one-size-fits-all technological quick fix. But we can't ignore the fact that researchers are actively trying to fix the underlying data problem. I mean, it's not an entirely hopeless landscape for questionnaires, right?
Not at all. Rigorous psychometric validation is difficult, yes, but it is entirely possible. In that same systematic review highlighting the 81% failure rate, researchers pointed to a few tools that actually do pass the test.
Okay, like which ones?
Look at the VSQ, the Vulvovaginal Symptoms Questionnaire, or the DIVA, which measures the day-to-day impact of vaginal aging.
And both of those actually passed the brutal Cosmin criteria.
They did. They demonstrated proven structural validity, excellent internal consistency, and reliable responsiveness.
Now, to be fair to the nuance here, the sources do note that those specific tools were designed more to capture the burning, dryness, and atrophy associated with menopause. So they currently lack comprehensive modules for the structural, mechanical sensation of laxity or overlapping urinary symptoms.
That is completely true. They aren't the perfect tool for laxity yet, but they act as a proof of concept.
They show it can be done.
Yes. They prove that if clinical researchers are willing to put in the grueling, unglamorous work, if they actually consult patients during the design phase to establish content validity rather than just guessing what women feel, they can create a standardized tool that captures subjective experience with objective mathematical reliability.
It seems like the immediate mandate for the field is the development of a core outcome set specifically for vaginal laxity. An agreed upon international minimum set of metrics that every future trial just has to report on using fully validated tools so we can finally start comparing apples to apples.
Exactly. Until that core outcome set is established, the data will remain fractured, and the true efficacy of any novel treatment will remain cloaked in statistical noise.
Which brings us to the end of our analysis for today. We've seen that the human body's lived experience is infinitely complex, and right now, the static questionnaires used to measure vaginal laxity are just too unvalidated to effectively bridge the gap between what a patient feels and what a clinical trial can prove.
The gap between the subjective experience and the objective evidence is still just entirely too wide.
But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that stretches just a bit beyond the current literature. We've spent this entire deep dive analyzing how incredibly difficult it is to engineer a perfect subjective questionnaire. We're essentially trying to capture a fluid, dynamic human experience on a static piece of paper.
Right.
But as we accelerate into an era of advanced biowearables and continuous digital health tracking, an era where smart rings track our sleep architecture to the millisecond and biosensors monitor glucose in real time, could we eventually move beyond the static questionnaire entirely?
Oh, that's fascinating.
Right. What if the future of validating intimate health conditions doesn't rely on a patient trying to remember how she felt last Tuesday on a 1 to 5 scale? What if the future relies on passive, continuous biomechanical feedback, perhaps through smart fabrics or microscopic non-invasive pelvic sensors that continuously map tissue tension and muscle load?
Taking the clipboard out of the equation completely.
Exactly. What if technology finally gives a continuous, objective voice to the subjective patient experience? Because until we invent that future, or until we standardize our clinical rubrics, we are still just trying to read a broken X-ray. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep questioning the data, and we will catch you next time.